Bilha, thank you for joining me today. You're the CEO of Great Carbon Valley, developing direct air capture and storage and other green industrial projects in East Africa. I'm Karol Kaczmarek, the co-founder of Net Zero Compare. Our audience wants to understand how your model can turn Kenya's Rift Valley into a credible hub for durable carbon removal. And that brings us to the first question: why the Rift Valley? If you could tell us what makes Kenya's Rift Valley a strong location for direct air carbon capture and storage: geology, geothermal power, permitting, or all of the above? How do you weigh these siting criteria?
Thanks, Caro, and good to be here. Yeah, so as you indicated, actually everything that you said is what makes Kenya or the Rift Valley quite unique for direct air capture and storage as an industry. And the other thing that I would also add is talent. So I'd start off with the fact that direct air capture is a very energy intensive industry, so requires a lot of energy and renewable energy because it needs to be green energy. So in Kenya in particular, we have the unique advantage of having a very green grid. So our power sources are about 93% renewable, which means that we have excess renewable energy, unlike other countries where which are still fossil driven. So it means that any renewable energy coming online should really be used to decarbonize the grid before you use it to remove carbon. We have the opposite problem where we have too much renewable energy without a lot of use cases. And so we look at direct air capture as a really good energy intensive industry that can actually help unlock some of our energy resources that are currently not developed because of lack of demand. Secondly, the fact that because of being on the Rift Valley, there's a lot of basaltic rock formation. So the geology allows us to store carbon underground. And in our case, we have the unique advantage of the fact that both the basalts and the geothermal resources are co-located, which therefore means that we can locate a lot of dark companies around the same area where you have geothermal and storage happening. And this is particularly important for dark applications that require excess heat or have heat requirements. So we can use some of the waste heat from geothermal for the same. And lastly, of course, the fact that we have a lot of talent. People don't realize this, but Africa is the youngest continent, Kenya in particular. We have a lot of young, talented engineers. So there's lots of talent that can actually take advantage of this industry. And yes, of course, the government is quite alive to the potential of this industry to transform the economy. Most of this will be, an export oriented market. So that's really good for the country, and also just developing a whole new industry. So it's a range of factors, but you very rarely find a country or a region where all the different things you need to get direct air capture happening, sort of all coming together. So that's part of why we chose to look into this particular industry.
As people say, location, location, location. And
Precisely.
Exactly. And now let's talk about partners. You have announced collaborations exploring direct air carbon capture and storage, including work with Climeworks and Carbfix, and a development partnership with Yama. How do these roles complement each other, and what joint milestones should we watch next?
So because we look at ourselves as both systems orchestrator, what I mean by that is you have different companies that provide different aspects of the technology. So whether it's looking at Climeworks or Yama, who have the dark technology, you're looking at Carbfix, who have storage. But the thing is, or at least what we're finding out with direct air capture as an industry, is having the technology is not enough. You have to figure out, once you have the technology, you have to find where to put it. So what land are you going to use? Where is the energy going to come from? Do you need permits, regulations, and a lot of other infrastructure. So usually that's not the work that direct air capture companies should really be focusing on. The other thing is most of these companies are not necessarily from Kenya, or a lot of these companies, they're developing the technology in countries that might not be suitable for dark and storage siting. So they probably develop the technology, say in Switzerland or in France. But then when it actually comes to doing the actual capture, you need to be in a site where you have storage, you have heat, and you have renewable energy, etc. So because of that, the synergies come in the fact that you want the technology companies to focus on developing the technology, but not having to worry about all these other factors, especially in countries that they're not familiar. They don't necessarily have staff members. And really, it's not economical for them to come and start figuring out how to do things in a new geography. So we are positioning ourselves as being able to, one, identify suitable sites, and then provide the necessary infrastructure. So whether it's working with CubFix and saying, what will it take for us to provide storage? Working with energy developers and saying, well, what will it take for them to provide the necessary energy? And ultimately, the goal is to provide what we'd call a plug and play solution for dark companies so that they can come in and all the different things that they need to get their technologies running are going. Of course, that doesn't always happen as smoothly as that. Of course, there's a lot of considerations. These are long-term infrastructure projects. So there's a lot of collaboration that is required. We need to understand their requirements. We need to work together with the energy developers. So there's a lot of collaboration that is required, and it helps to have someone in the middle that's kind of making sure that everyone is talking to each other. And then finally, of course, we're working in a regulated environment, so you have to work with governments, with the local communities, get the necessary environmental permits. So there's a lot of that other underlying work that people don't usually think about. And again, it's not in the interest of the dark company to have to do all that. If someone else can do that work, then they can focus on the dark piece, then we think some of these things will move a lot faster. In terms of key milestones that we to expect, again, these are long-term projects as we are learning. But what we've now done, at least, is we've done some initial feasibility studies, and we're hoping to prove storage capabilities. So we're working, we're working quite closely with Sela, who is also a local storage partner in Kenya. Working with CubFix. So for us, we're looking to work with multiple partners because we think there's a lot of carbon to remove from the air. And then we will be seeing, a few small pilots coming up in the next 2 years, but really hoping to see some large scale projects coming up at least before 2030.
That's great to hear. And such partnerships obviously make scale more realistic.
Yes.
Let's talk about financing first projects. How are you structuring the first projects financially? What is the right mix, let's say, of offtake, concessional capital, and project debt for direct air carbon capture and storage in East Africa? And which risks are the hardest to bank today?
I think for us, of course, because it's such a new industry, and we have to to answer your second question around the risks, usually you have to, because it's a very new industry, hasn't really been done. So we have to do some initial pilots around the storage piece, because that's the one thing that is that still hasn't been proven. So there's and that's kind of what we're looking. We think and we hope that a lot of that funding should ideally come from grants or concessions. At least a first of a kind sort of storage or pilot storage projects. With the dark piece, direct air capture piece, because a lot of the technology is being developed elsewhere, we hope that by the time the dark companies are coming, to some extent, they've de-risked some of their technology, and a lot of them tend to be financed by venture funded. But then, of course, now for the small pilots, the first initial pilots, they will probably still use some VC funding and maybe a mix of small grants to get that going. But really, once we start looking at large scale installations, at that point we have to start looking at project finance. Of course, we've seen some for some projects, we've seen some offtake funding where we're, pre-financing for guaranteed offtake in the future. And that's very helpful to at least get some pilots going, or at least get the technologies to develop to a certain level of maturity. And so I think that funding continues to be important for, early on. But then we soon have to then now start shifting into project finance because for some of the larger scale implementations, you're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So at that scale, you really are talking about project finance and primarily debt to a large extent.
Understood. Yeah. Let's connect finance to measurement. MRV, so measurement, reporting, and verification and standards. Which methodologies and data streams will you use to demonstrate net removals and storage permanence? And how are you aligning with buyers and standards bodies that operate, let's say, globally?
So at the moment, we're working with global players for MRV. And in this case, the way we are structuring it is we are allowing, or we want DAC companies to work with whatever providers that they're most comfortable with. So we're I don't want to say agnostic, but we're somewhat agnostic on who the player, who the standard provider would be. Or we make sure, of course, at the end of the day, because these projects are only successful if the end buyers are able to verify and say that this project, these credits are actually valid and they actually work. So to avoid a lot of back and forth and complications, we essentially are working with your typical global players. And the thing is, because the carbon market is a global market and a lot of the buyers are global, it only makes sense for us to work with global verifiers, or at least verifiers who everyone is comfortable with. So both the buyer is comfortable, and we as a project developers are comfortable with. So I would say the way to think about it is it's your standard MRV that any DAC and storage project is doing. So there really should be no difference from, say, what Climeworks is doing in Iceland to how they end up, how we end up working on doing the project in Kenya. Of course, we recognize that there's probably going to be quite a bit of progress in terms of standards and methodologies and things. We're keenly looking at things like the compliance markets and Article 6 and how they're going to define MRV for carbon removal projects, and especially DAC. So of course, we will be putting all those into consideration, but the way to think about it is the same way MRV is happening for a project in the US, the same way MRV will happen here.
Plus, that level of evidence should help buyers commit 100%.
Precisely. Yeah.
Direct air carbon capture needs steady power and careful water management, as we know. How will you source low carbon power and manage water in a way that does not compete with local communities?
I think with the power piece, I think it's important to make the point that in this part of the world, we are in a different situation compared to what you have, say, in the global north. As I mentioned, we have a lot of potential for power, or a lot of power potential. The problem is because there's no demand. So what I mean by that is we're not in a situation where if I came and situated an industry, it will be taking away power from anyone. If anything, what that industry will do is actually spur the development of more power, because we work with a lot of energy developers who have excess capacity, or at least would have excess capacity, but they can't bring it online because there's no demand for it, or there's no offtake for it. So if anything, for us, having direct air capture and other industries come to the Rift Valley or to Kenya or East Africa is actually a good thing, because it will actually catalyze the development of energy that's sitting around and underutilized. So it's actually, and then hopefully that would mean even more energy coming into the system, and hopefully lower pricing for everyone. So I think the way to think about it is people right now we have lots of potential of energy. We're not developing it, which means that energy remains very scarce and very expensive. If you have a large player coming in and saying, I will catalyze the development of this large, significant amount of power, it's actually very helpful because it then now says power producers have the PPAs and the financing to then go out and develop the power, which then means you're actually increasing the amount of energy that's being produced in the country. Same thing with water. I mean, the way we're thinking about water, it's a very highly regulated, of course, key infrastructure. So of course we'll be, doing this in strict measure, just of course following, key regulations. We've had at least some, because Kenya is a large geothermal producer, we've already had quite a bit of practice around how do you actively manage water use in some of these industries where you're drilling in the ground and, having to re-inject water back into the ecosystem. But yes, so we are being, and then in some cases, actually, what we're looking at is by developing water resources, we'd actually share the water resources with the community. So there are places we're going to where the communities don't have access to water, but the reason they don't have access to water is because the water resources have not been developed because there was no funding to develop it, whether it's digging wells or piping the water from, say, a river, or whatever the case might be. So part of our plans in the different sites we are working on is we would actually be working with the local community to say, how do we ensure that by bringing water to our site means that the community around us actually has access to water, water is coming closer to them. So I think we're in a different sort of paradigm where these projects would actually help activate the provision of water and energy, unlike other places where it looks like you're competing with it for existing resources. Yeah.
Perfect. Since we touched on communities, let's talk also about community and land. So carbon projects in Africa, as we know, are under scrutiny on land rights and benefit sharing. What governance, consent, and revenue sharing practices are you putting in place from day one?
I think there are two things. So one, just Kenya recently passed a climate action bill about just over a year ago, and the bill is very clear around revenue sharing for different projects, and of course it also depends on whether the project is on private land or community land. So in a case where we'd be doing a project on a community land, there's already a legal requirement by the government, and it articulates how the resources will be shared at both at a government level, community level, and other sub-national levels, and then what goes to the developer. But we are keen to, because of the kinds of projects, but I think in many cases, those projects would ideally be things like nature-based projects. So things like tree planting or soil regeneration type projects, because those tend to happen in community land. Because we are looking to do things like direct air capture, and we want to co-locate those with geothermal power development. To a large extent, we want to do this on private land, because Kenya has a lot of private land ownership, and we would want to do that on private land so that you're leasing directly from a private landowner with a clear contract, and that way you are not coming into community land and having to get into those sorts of negotiations. I think the other thing to also note with DAC versus other solutions is because DAC has a very small footprint in terms of how much land you require. Unlike if we are doing a nature-based solution, say tree planting, for you to do it at scale, you need thousands and thousands of acres for it to really be beneficial, because you need to plant lots of trees that capture carbon. But you can do the same capture of carbon on a few acres of land. Could be 2 or 3 acres of land of a direct air capture unit could capture what thousands of lots of acres of tree planting would be. So I think that also shifts the dynamic a little bit, because a lot of the scrutiny that we're currently hearing on Africa, which is true, is very much dependent on the previous era, which was a lot of the CDM era type projects, which were mostly nature-based and mostly tree planting or mangrove, sort of projects. So, and all of them invariably end up being on community land just because of how much land is required to really, make them viable. I think with things like technological carbon removal projects like direct air capture or biochar, it's easier to think of them as factories or industries whereby you're just setting this up on a small piece of land relatively, and it's easier to do those on private land and where you're negotiating directly with a private landowner. But even then, I think just from a goodwill gesture, would still engage the local community and see how can we support them in terms of the things I was talking about earlier: water provision, energy, things like school building, but also providing jobs for the local community when necessary. So I think the conversation needs to shift into that rather than community land rights, as it were.
So at the end of the day, communities will also benefit afterwards.
Precisely.
I also wanted to ask you about another project that you launched. Mm-hmm. You co-founded Jacob's Ladder Africa to grow green skills. What kinds of jobs will direct air carbon capture and storage and the green industry create locally? And how are you preparing young people and women to access them?
I think the way to think about it is we want to build an entire industry and ecosystem, and usually that comes with its own different jobs. So if you think about a direct air capture and storage camp or project, there's of course the direct jobs that go into that particular industry, whether it's the scientists, the engineers, geologists that are working on it. But then there's also the work around the construction itself. So even as you bring in the construction, so there's a lot of lots of jobs that would come through that. And so for the way we're thinking about it is depending on the industry, some and then of course there's things like the monitoring and the monitoring piece. Who's collecting that data? Are they trained on how to to understand these things? Do they understand what the carbon markets are and how they work, etc.? So the way to think about it is that it's a wide range of jobs. There's of course the direct jobs which would come in, whether it's, as I mentioned, things like the engineers or the scientists that are working directly on this project. Because we're actually demanding energy, we are hoping that there's going to be energy being developed. So I'll just give a quick example. One of our partners is doing a small pilot in one of our partner sites, and they came in and they wanted to do a quick pilot, so they put up a solar plant. And so in addition to just the pilot they were doing, there was the solar plant generation and the development of the solar plant, for which they engaged a local company and local providers thereby. So, and then of course there's so those kinds of direct jobs, but then I think for me there's also the indirect jobs that come from having industry around. So if you build a big factory, say a factory that's going to do green ammonia, which is one of the green industry projects that have been developed, yes, it's a factory itself and the workers that it employs, but then within that, you start having service industries around it. So whether it's what's the accommodation, who's providing services to the factory, what are the small SMEs around it that are providing auxiliary services for it. So the way I like to think about it is, if you bring in an industry, it's economic transformation that's a lot more, that goes beyond just that one industry. There's a logistics providers. All of a sudden, truck companies have jobs because they're evacuating goods. Then maybe we can talk to the truck companies and say, can you be green in your operations? How do we help them become more electric? Which then means we might need to train electric mechanics who can repair these vehicles and operate them. So you can tell there's an interesting ecosystem that's starting to invariably build around the green industrialization. But we do need, the way I think about it is that we do need at least some key anchor projects that then you can build around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Talent pipelines tend to actually de-risk delivery. And how do you think about a portfolio that could include direct air carbon capture and storage together with other high durability pathways in Africa? Do you see enhanced rock weathering or mineralization projects as complementary?
Yes, I like to say that there's a lot of carbon to go around. So I think we need all the pathways as quickly as possible. And secondly, we co-founded a Carbon Removal Alliance in Kenya, and part of it was to advocate the development of durable carbon removal pathways. And so that's everything from direct air capture to biochar to enhanced rock weathering. And we want to make sure that we have a strong voice as an industry, because there's a lot of education that's needed. For me, we need to position Africa as a source of high quality carbon removal credits, which right now there's not a lot of that going on. A lot of the carbon removal work or the carbon projects in Africa tend to be the low carbon, the lower end, where it's, probably people are making $5 to $20 per ton. Yet there's this whole new industry where people, the credits are a lot more valuable because they're more permanent. And so people can actually make more money, and create better jobs, etc. But you see, the thing is, if we only try and get one industry going, then you really don't have the credibility. But if we sort of if people begin to see Africa as a source of good quality carbon removal across a range of industries, I think that's actually very, very good for us. Then I think there's also the synergies that you build, whether it's figuring out how to advise the government in terms of the right policies. How do we create the right incentives for people to invest, both local people, external people? How do we get the right talent? Again, it's hard to do that when you're just sort of focusing on one vertical. I think it's easier for us to do so when there's multiple verticals that are that are at play. And I think, as I said, there's a lot of carbon that we need to remove from the air. I mean, it's gigatons levels over the coming years, and no one pathway will be able to be this, the solution. So again, from a climate perspective, you definitely want to make sure that we want to have all the solutions if we have any chance of hitting the targets that we've set for ourselves.
That's a very interesting view. And what about specific policy moves in Kenya or in the region would speed responsible deployment, in your view? Storage regulation, access to renewables, MRV, as we discussed, measurement, reporting, and verification guidance, or procurement by state-owned buyers?
I think again, when you think about the global South and especially Africa, we're a very low emitting country or countries, partly because we have low industrialization, and then in the case of Kenya, our energy is already green, so you don't have a lot of state buyers because there's really no need for a lot of people we don't need to offset a lot of carbon because they're not producing much of it. So a lot of actually for us, I think the bigger thing would be, and we're starting to see some of this, but it would be helpful to see carbon projects from Africa being able to access compliance markets in the global north. So say getting into the EU compliance market or, the US compliance markets, because that's where emission is happening or carbon emission is happening. But what we're saying is that we don't need to remove any carbon because we don't need to offset anything because we're not emitting a lot of carbon. If anything, in some cases, we might find that we're net negative emitters. So I think being able to access those compliance markets would actually be very helpful in terms of growing the industry. Locally, I think things like renewable energy policy, of course, we can always be improved, but that's already working quite well. We're starting to work with the government to figure out the storage regulations, again, because it's a very new industry. At least in Kenya, because we already have a history of geothermal, there's quite a lot of body of work to already build on. So the country has already developed enough a lot of regulations around, drilling and responsible drilling and, management of the subsurface. So I think it's just working with them to figure out how we we regulate the carbon storage piece. But for us, what we've been telling them, and I think they get it, which is you want to sort of encourage experimentation and not regulate too much until you really understand the industry. So it's almost like, can the industry and the government work together to provide the right regulations, but in a way that also allows for projects to experiment, pilot, etc., which so far they've been willing to do so. And but we think, yes, definitely getting the right regulation around that would be very helpful, because it allows the industry to grow without worrying that there'll be a new change in policy in the coming years. But I also do recognize it's a very new industry. So I mean, outside of even the EU and a few other countries, I'm sure they're still trying to find their own policies. They're still trying to finalize their policies around carbon storage.
Yes, makes sense. Let's end with what to watch, milestones for credibility. What technical and commercial markers in the next, let's say, 12, 24 months would show that the Great Carbon Valley vision is moving from plans to steel in the ground?
I think for me, if at least we and our partners can prove carbon storage, I think it's a big milestone for me, because we need to. It moves us from, we know we can store carbon in the Rift Valley, to actually showcasing that we've stored, and it doesn't have to be a lot of carbon. I think we're just talking about a few tons that we've been able to, we can store underground and actually have proof points that it's mineralizing, which means that it's it's starting to be permanently stored. And we're hoping that in the next 12 months that should be, we should be able to make an announcement around that. Secondly, and we've started to see this, but I think we hope that in the next, again, we'll probably have a few pilots. Not necessarily large scale dark projects, but at least, having a few dark companies that are coming to do their pilots in the Rift Valley, and hopefully powered by geothermal or other renewable energy resources. And then thirdly, I think this is not necessarily something that is fully in our control, but it'd be really great if we're able to see some of the projects that are done here being able to access or sell their credits to global players or to global markets. So if we can have some of the announcements on companies saying we sold our credits to either some of the large voluntary buyers or some of the more institutional buyers, and actually having those deals being announced globally, I think is actually very helpful, because it moves the conversation from we think this can happen to showing that here are large, credible global players that have the confidence that the work that's being done in Kenya in the Rift Valley is world class and is acceptable at global levels.
That's clear. And those checkpoints you've just mentioned should give at least everyone a way to track progress.
Yes.
Before we wrap up, is there anything important we have not covered that you would like to add?
I think this was very comprehensive, so thank you for that. But I think just reiterating the fact that we have a lot of renewable energy with a lot of these resources. So I think it's important to make the point that for us, having green industry is actually very positive, because it helps us unlock resources that are currently stuck. So unlike, because usually sometimes I get this question on should the West be bringing its problems to Kenya or to Africa? Should we be seeing, shouldn't it be the emitters' responsibilities to remove the carbon? But the way we look at it is that this is an investment. We have the resources that the world needs to decarbonize, so whether it's the land or the energy, and because carbon is evenly distributed, so whether we're the ones who emitted it or not, we're all suffering the same effects of climate change, if not worse. For us, it's actually a positive. We see this as a positive thing if Kenya and East Africa and just Africa in general can contribute to decarbonization, and in the process get to build industries around it and create jobs for its young people. So I think shifting that paradigm shift is actually important, where we're saying we can help the world decarbonize by using the resources we have, and in turn we hope that it will create jobs and economic opportunities for people.
Bilha, thank you so much for your time and the insights. We'll publish the highlights on Net Zero Compare so our audience can see how Great Carbon Valley aims to make high durability carbon removal investable and beneficial for local communities.
Thank you so much, Carol, and I look forward to seeing